The footage runs for 41 seconds, and for most of it, nothing happens. Green and gray static. The slow drift of grass.
A rancher in central Texas pulls the memory card from a trail camera he hasn't checked in 3 weeks. He's expecting the usual 40, 50 clips of hogs tearing up the ground around his stock tank, the same nightly parade he's filmed for years. Instead, the folder is almost empty. A few deer, some wind in the grass, and then, near the end, one grainy clip he watches twice before he understands what he's looking at. It isn't hogs anymore. It's coyotes, 4 or 5 of them, moving through the frame with a kind of order that doesn't look like scavenging. It looks like a plan. He didn't know it yet, but he was looking at the beginning of an answer wildlife biologists across the state had been chasing for years. Why? In certain pockets of hog country, one of the toughest, most destructive animals in America was quietly disappearing, and why the people whose job it was to kill those hogs were starting to stand down instead. To understand why that trail camera clip mattered, you first have to understand the size of the problem it was answering. Feral hogs are not a minor nuisance in the United States. Wildlife agencies estimate there are somewhere around 6 million of them spread across at least 35 states, and the population keeps expanding into places that never used to have them. Texas carries the heaviest load, with an estimated 2 to 3 million feral hogs rooting through ranchland, river bottoms, farmland, and increasingly the edges of suburbs. These are not small animals. A mature hog commonly weighs over 150 pounds, and boars pushing past 300 pounds are not rare. They carry curved tusks that self-sharpen as the animal grows, thick hide across the shoulders, and an appetite that behaves less like an individual eating and more like a machine processing everything in its path. The damage these animals do is well documented and expensive. Feral hogs are estimated to cause well over $1 billion in agricultural and property damage across the U.S. each year, with older Texas legislative estimates alone putting in-state damage in the hundreds of millions annually, a figure that has almost certainly grown since. They don't graze the way deer do. They root, driving their snouts into soil to dig up grubs, roots, and bulbs, and in doing so they can turn a pasture or a cornfield into something that looks plowed rather than grazed. Fences get pushed over. Irrigation lines get snapped. Creek banks erode where hogs have wallowed. Beyond crops, hogs foul water sources, compete with native wildlife like deer and turkey for food, and are known to eat the eggs and young of ground-nesting birds and reptiles. They can also carry diseases capable of affecting livestock, which is part of why agricultural agencies take the population so seriously. For decades, the response to all of this has been almost entirely human-driven and almost entirely expensive. Texas legalized hog hunting from helicopters specifically because the population had gotten so far out of hand that aerial gunning was seen as one of the only tools capable of removing large numbers quickly. Alongside that, agencies and private landowners have poured money into corral traps with remote-triggered gates, poison bait research that has been controversial because of the risk to non-target animals, and even research into hog-specific contraceptives. And even with all of that spending, the numbers have been stubborn. Biologists commonly cite a brutal statistic. Because a female hog can breed before she's a year old and produce 2 litters a year, you typically have to remove somewhere around 60 to 70% of a local population annually just to keep it from growing. Fall short of that, and the population doesn't hold steady, it climbs. Which is why, when reports started coming out of certain counties, describing hog populations shrinking or disappearing from areas, without any corresponding spike in trapping or hunting, wildlife biologists didn't just accept it as good news. They wanted to know what was actually happening, because a population collapse with no obvious human cause is the kind of thing that raises real questions. Was it disease? Was something else going on that could eventually matter for livestock or even people? The clue that pointed toward an answer wasn't new. It had been sitting in old trail camera archives for years. Back in the early 2010s, researchers studying feral hog movement in Texas and Georgia started paying closer attention to something that had always been treated as background noise: coyotes showing up in hog territory. For a long time, the assumption among hunters, and even some wildlife managers, was that coyotes were opportunistic scavengers at best when it came to hogs, maybe picking at a carcass that was already dead, maybe grabbing an already weak piglet, but not a real predator of a species known for aggressive, protective sows. Adult hogs are dangerous animals. A sow defending piglets will charge, and there are widely told stories among ranchers and hunters of dogs, and even people being seriously hurt by a cornered or provoked hog. The conventional wisdom was simple. Coyotes don't mess with hogs in any way that matters. Diet studies started to complicate that assumption. Research out of Texas and Georgia around 2014 examined coyote stomach and scat samples in areas with dense hog populations and found that in some locations, hog remains, overwhelmingly from piglets rather than adults, made up a substantial share of what coyotes were eating. In some samples estimated around a third of their diet. That's a significant number for a species long dismissed as a background scavenger. The official read from wildlife agencies has generally been more measured than dramatic. The Texas Parks and Wildlife Department notes that coyotes, along with bobcats and even golden eagles, do opportunistically prey on young, immature hogs, but describes this predation as playing a real yet still fairly minor role in overall hog mortality across most of the country, since humans remain the dominant source of hog deaths in the U.S. It's a different picture from a Texas coastal or river bottom county, where mountain lions, black bears, or alligators are present, because in those specific ecosystems predation on hogs can be more frequent and more significant. So the honest version of the story sits between two extremes. It isn't that coyotes are single-handedly wiping out the feral hog population across the country. The math on hog reproduction is simply too aggressive for that to be true everywhere. But it also isn't nothing. In localized areas with dense coyote packs and heavy hog breeding activity, coyotes appear to be doing real, measurable work removing piglets before they reach breeding age, and ranchers in hog country have long noticed the pattern anecdotally. Places with strong, undisturbed coyote populations often seem to have fewer hog problems than places where coyotes have been heavily trapped or shot. One Texas rancher's line, repeated in agricultural columns for years, sums up the folk wisdom. He says he's never seen hogs holding steady in a pasture where coyotes are actively working it. This is where the predator's reputation becomes genuinely interesting, because coyotes are, in a very real sense, the most successful adaptable predator in North America. This is an animal that survived a century of organized extermination campaigns, bounties, poison programs, government-funded eradication efforts aimed specifically at wiping coyotes off the map, and instead of disappearing, expanded. Coyotes now live in all of the lower 48 states, including the middle of major cities, something almost no other mid-sized North American predator has managed. Part of how they did it is dietary flexibility. When rabbits crash, they switch to rodents. When deer thin out, they eat fruit and insects, and when a landscape suddenly offers an abundant, slow-moving, protein-rich food source that reproduces itself constantly, like feral hog piglets, coyotes adapt to exploit it. That's not mysticism. It's just what a generalist predator does when the environment hands it an opportunity. There's also real, if less cinematic, evidence that coyotes hunting in groups can use coordinated tactics against larger prey like deer fawns, something documented in wildlife research going back decades. One animal drawing attention while others approach from another direction. Whether that same kind of group coordination is consistently used against hog sounders, specifically targeting juveniles while avoiding a defensive sow, is something researchers are still actively studying rather than something fully proven across the board. What's fair to say, based on the actual evidence, is this: coyotes are intelligent, social, adaptable hunters. They've been shown through diet studies to prey meaningfully on young hogs in specific regions, and wherever that predation is happening at scale, it appears to put a real dent in local hog population growth, because removing piglets before they can breed hits the population at its most vulnerable point. That's also why some land managers have started rethinking blanket predator control. For a long time, coyotes were treated as a pest to be removed right alongside hogs, hunted or trapped without much distinction, in the same general effort to protect livestock and land. But if a healthy coyote population in a given area is doing real work suppressing juvenile hog numbers for free, every single night, without a helicopter, a trap, or a chemical bait program, then removing those coyotes on top of removing hogs can be counterproductive. You lose a source of natural pressure on the species you're actually trying to control. This is part of why some wildlife biologists and agricultural extension writers have started making the case, publicly, for leaving coyote populations largely alone in hog-heavy areas, rather than treating every coyote as an equal threat to livestock. It's a shift in thinking, not a dramatic government program being shut down overnight, but it reflects a real reassessment of who the actual allies are in the fight against an invasive species that has, so far, outbred and outadapted almost everything humans have thrown at it. None of this means the hog problem is being solved. It isn't. Even in areas where coyote predation on piglets is measurable, the math still overwhelmingly favors the hogs. A single sow can produce 2 litters a year with 4 to 6 piglets each, sometimes more, and across a landscape with 6 million feral hogs and growing. No predator population, however adaptable, is positioned to reverse that trend on its own. What coyotes appear to be doing, in the places where the data is strongest, is slowing local growth and thinning vulnerable young animals out of specific sounders, meaningful, but not a solution, and not something that scales cleanly to every county or every state where hogs have become established. Texas alone still spends significant public and private money every year on trapping, aerial removal, and fencing, and will likely continue to for the foreseeable future, because no single method, natural or human, has proven capable of bringing the total population down on its own. What makes this worth paying attention to isn't a secret government cover-up or some undiscovered superpredator in the brush. It's something more grounded and, honestly, more interesting. An ordinary, familiar animal that almost everyone had underestimated for a century, quietly filling a role nobody assigned it, doing measurable damage to an invasive species' weakest point simply because the opportunity was there, and coyotes, more than almost any other predator on the continent, know how to take opportunities. It's a reminder that ecosystems under pressure don't always respond the way models predict, and that sometimes the animal everyone dismissed as background noise turns out to be doing real work, right at the edge of the frame, on a trail camera nobody bothered to watch twice. So here's the honest question worth sitting with, not a dramatic one, but a real one biologists are still working through. In places where coyotes are left alone to do what they already do, how much of a dent can that actually make over the next decade against a species that breeds this fast and has already spread this far? Is natural predation ever going to be more than a supporting piece next to trapping and hunting? Or could sustained pressure in the right places genuinely shift local population trends over time? That's the debate happening right now among the people who manage this land for a living, and it's one worth watching rather than assuming an answer to.